So, it's probably pirates, eh? You just saw the words use the duty finder to enter. Or you're a returning player trying to fresh up your memory. Or you're a veteran looking up beginner's guides because you're bored. Well, for whatever reason you're here, I'm here to help you out get started with Dungeons of Final Fantasy XIV. I will be splitting up this guide into 4 sections: general advice and role-specific advice for each individual role. I will timestamp these, but I do recommend watching the full thing to get a grasp of what everyone is supposed to do. Before you even think about queuing up, we need to check our gear. Please check that you have something equipped in every gear slot. Having something is always better than nothing, and if you want some good gear for your first dungeon, check out the Hall of the Novice by talking to any Smith NPC. By finishing the challenges, you get some pretty good gear for your current level, and you get a ring that gives you an XP buff. As for queuing up, you don't need to stay near the dungeon, and you can queue up while being anywhere in the world. You can also do different content such as quests while waiting. Well, that is as long as you don't play healer or maybe a tank. Queue times can vary massively by the role you play, by the time of day, and how relevant the content is. If you're doing 5-year-old side content while playing a damage dealer at 4 AM, you can expect your queue times to be much longer than if you do main story content while playing a healer at peak times. Before we get into our dungeon, let's talk about the limit breaks. The limit break meter is a party-wide resource that fills up as you go through a dungeon. Once it's filled, one party member can use a limit break, and the meter resets to 0. What the limit break does is dependent on your role. If you play a tank, it might be a group-wide damage reduction. If you play a healer, it might be a group-wide resurrection. And as a damage dealer, it then depends even further on which type of DPS you play. As limit breaks are typically reserved for the damage dealers, I will talk about limit breaks further in their part of the guide. You can add limit breaks to your HOT by pressing P and then going to the general tab. Oh, and also, whatever role or job you play, please read your tooltips. It might seem like a drag, but it will make your life a lot easier. The queue pops and into a loading screen we go. Don't forget to swap to the party chat and say a quick hello and let the party know it's your first time here. Well, that is, if it is. The Final Fantasy XIV community is typically very helpful and supportive towards new players. That being said, if you'd rather know what you need to do in your current dungeon and don't feel comfortable going in blind, there are a lot of guides online that help you through all of the nooks and crannies. Early on, most things are quite self-explanatory though. About loot. To obtain gear, you press one of the roll buttons and the system rolls a 100-sided dice for you. The person with the highest number gets the loot. Well, normally that is. There are 3 different options: need, greed, and pass. You can only cast need if your class can currently use the gear. This is slightly skewed in the early game, as the gear here isn't as restricted yet, and also sometimes it feels like you can't roll need for accessories no matter what, but I'm not completely sure about that one. Then there's greed, which also rolls the dice, but this has a lower priority than need. So if someone presses need, they will always get the gear, even if it rolled higher. Pass rolls a 0 automatically, disabling you from getting the gear. And one last thing, always let your tank attack the monsters first so you can properly gain their aggro. If you do accidentally get their attention, walk to the tank so they can more easily take it over. Let's start with the tanks. First things first, we need to check that our tank stance is on. This is typically indicated by some feature on your HUD. Tank stances increase your enmity, also known as threat or aggro. Your goal as a tank is to have the highest enmity possible that all the mobs in the dungeon attack you. I like to get a mob group to aggro me by throwing out a ranged attack and then hitting everyone with 1 or 2 area of effect attacks, also known as AoEs. After this, most mobs should have your attention. You can check if a monster is focusing you by looking at the symbol next to their name. If it is red, it is. If it's anything else, try attacking it or using abilities on it. Also, don't be afraid to at least pull 2 packs of monsters or more. It is way less scary than it might look, and it will increase the speed in which you complete the dungeon by a lot. That being said, monster packs between boss fights are actually quite a bit harder than the actual boss fights themselves, so please use your damage mitigations such as Rampart, Reprisal, or more job-specific ones during these mob packs instead of during the boss fights. I really cannot emphasize this enough. As rule of thumb, if there are 3 or more monsters, keep on using your AoE abilities to get everyone down as soon as possible. And while boss fights are typically quite straightforward, turn the boss away from the party and just keep on hitting them while trying to dodge the attacks they throw at you. But do try to stay stationary and move the boss not at all if possible. Let's now get to the healers. If you come from other games, the way healers are played in Final Fantasy XIV might be a shock to you. Our goal is to deal as much damage as possible while keeping our party alive. Monsters can't kill your party if there are no monsters left after all. So even though it seems scary, you can usually let your tank drop to half health or less before healing them, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. As most healers don't get an AoE attack until later, your best bet is to apply your damage over time abilities, also known as dots, to most monsters. Even though this can be job dependent, it's usually good to apply your dot to everyone if there are 4 monsters or less. Let's talk about your role actions. For now, let's only worry about Swift Cast, Asuna, and Lucid Dreaming. Swift Cast enables you to cast your next spell instantly. which is mostly used in combination with your resurrection spell to get those off instantly, as they typically have a very long cast time. As soon as it dispels debuffs such as poison from your allies, and Lucid Dreaming restores your MP over time, I like to use Lucid Dreaming as soon as it gets off cooldown, as long as I'm currently actively using my MP. As mentioned in the previous segment, the mob packs are parted in the boss fights, so if you have healing abilities that are on a longer cooldown, do use them here instead of saving them. Boss fights tend to be straightforward as well. Check that your DOT is active at all times and keep hitting away. But sometimes there might be moments where one has to interact with things. This is usually reserved for the healer, so the others can continue dealing most of the damage in the meantime. And as damage dealers, it's your job to deal as much damage while taking as little damage as possible. How to deal the most damage is very much job specific, but a rule of thumb is to use an AoE attack if there are 3 or more mobs, if you have one available. For DPS, the reading of your tooltip rule applies even more, as some attacks might have damage increases if you're attacking the enemy from a certain side, or if you used it as a combo. Also try to always stay on the opposite side of the tank when you're attacking monsters, so they can't hit you with their own AoE attacks that are known as cleaves. Do use your roll action as much as possible. They might have a longer cooldown, but they're there to be used, right? Let's talk about limit breaks a bit more. When used by mages, it will cost a big circular AoE. If used by ranged jobs, it will be a more linear AoE. And melee jobs will deal a single target blow with huge damage. The general consensus on limit breaks is to use them on the final boss of the dungeon, preferably by melee job, as they deal a huge amount of damage. I feel like it is hard to give more general advice for damage dealers without going into too job specific things. I hope this guide helped you to get a general overview on what to do in dungeon runs. If I forgot something that you might think is important, let me know in the comments. Also, if there's a topic you want me to talk about, let me know as well. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.